So let's discuss a little bit more about natural selection. So up to this point in the previous slides, we have shown these examples of these different organisms that end up having different phenotypic characteristics because we said that they adapted to their environment, and in that process, because of these different organisms are isolated from one another, they end up becoming different species, right? So we have specification is what we kind of ended with. So when we talk about this adaptation, what do we mean? What do we mean by this? And so we're moving on to natural selection. So let's kind of take a look at how this mechanism of evolution occurs. So how does natural selection, which is evolution, mechanism of evolution where the organisms are actually evolving to adapt to their environment, is brought about? Okay, so you have members of the population, right? So within a population of species, they have certain traits that are heritable and are able to be passed down to their offspring. Well, what is found is that the reason why over time you end up with species that are able to be better adapted to their environment is that they're in their ancestors, the individuals that had the favorable traits, well, they were the ones that were able to survive. And they were the ones that are able to reproduce more compared to those that lack the traits, right? So take into consideration that natural selection occurs over a certain period, right? It takes a few generations for these adaptations to actually occur. So this is kind of how it disproved Lamarck's theory, because Lamarck's theory just thought that, during just my generation, I will stretch my neck so long that I'm able to now grab tree branches that are much higher up, and I pass this on to my kids, and my kids will stretch their necks even further and be able to adapt. Well, that's not quite what happens. It's more that if I already had long necks to begin with, then I already have traits that are more favorable, and I can survive better, right? I can actually access the food. I'm more adapted to my environment, so I'm more likely to reproduce and have offspring compared to the giraffe over there that has a shorter neck and is not able to survive as well. So that giraffe is weaker, has a harder time being able to reproduce and succeed, and so it's less likely that the giraffes with shorter neck will reproduce as much as the giraffes that have longer neck. So this adaptation, what I want to point out is that it takes many generations, right? But over time, across generation, a larger population portion. So this is kind of this bullet point right here, which is telling us that across generation, populations that have more favorable traits are more adapted to their environment. Oops. More adapted to their environment. And it's because of these characteristics that these organisms are more suited for their environment, and because they're more suited for their environment, they're able to better reproduce. So they'll be able better to pass on these traits to offsprings. One thing that I want to kind of point out before we move on to the next slide is just this this picture of these snails that I have here. So you can see by looking at this picture, right, that these guys are able to blend much better to this tree compared to these guys right here, right? And so what I wanted to point out is that there's variation, as we can tell, in these tree shells, these tree snails shells, right? And so these snails aren't able to predict what type of tree bark they're going to end up living in, and they can adapt to this. But what can happen is that you can kind of imagine that the snails that are brighter and stand out a little bit more, right? These guys right here. their predators are able to more easily find them. And so because their predators are more easily able to find them, they're probably more likely to get consumed. And so one of the things that I want to point out is that when we're talking about adaptation, that the species that are living in those environments, they can't actually anticipate their future need. They can't actually play a role with regards to directing what future characteristics will be passed on. It's just that certain organisms are better to adapt compared to other ones because of the physical characteristics they have about. And I also want to bring about, or I also want to mention one other thing, which is that with regards to genetics and passing down, that sometimes new characteristics can arise not only from adaptation, but can also just arise from different variation in the genetics. So while you can't pass on gene, like as we mentioned in the previous slides, if I go blind, I don't pass on that blindness. But what could happen is that I might have, over my lifespan, have a certain mutation, and that mutation might lead to my offsprings inheriting those mutations. So there's other genetic component which we won't dive into heavily here, but I just kind of want to mention that some of the things that we should think about is that there are other ways to pass on certain traits to your offsprings that does happen genetically. So this might be due to mutation, this might be due to chromosomal rearrangement, this might be due to just the assortment of chromosomes during meiosis. So just kind of remember, like for example, for me, I have a different set of genes compared to my sibling, right? Even though we both have the same parents, we're just given different sets of genes. So we'll dive more into this when we actually discuss genetics and DNA. But I just in the back of your mind, just kind of think about that. That it's not only the environment they live in, but there are also sometimes certain genetic traits that can be passed, and it's not due to this anticipation of what will be needed. It's just due more to randomness, such as the assortment of chromosomes during meiosis. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so coming back to this whole idea of Lamarck versus Darwin and trying to understand the mechanism of evolution, what is the difference between the two, right? So if you recall, in our last lecture, we talked about the hypothesis Lamarck had, which is that these giraffes originally had very short neck, and they stretched their neck, so they're anticipating that they need longer neck. So they actually stretch their neck, and their stretching their neck is actually how they end up with long neck. So they just keep stretching and stretching until eventually they have these long necks. And so this is the hypothesis like Lamarck has. How is this different than what Darwin observed? Well, what Darwin hypothesized that it has more to do with reproductive fitness. So this idea that these individuals here, so we have a bunch of different giraffes here, they have different size neck, right? So we have some with shorter necks, and we have some here with longer necks. And so you can kind of imagine that the giraffes that have the longer neck are more able to gather food, right? Because they have longer necks, they survive a little bit better. So Darwin proposed that because of their longer neck and their ability to adapt better to an environment, that these guys with the longer necks are more likely to survive. And because they're more likely to survive and be healthy, they're going to produce more offspring. And it is the production of their more offspring that over time, right? So once again, emphasizing the idea that adaptation takes many generations. But over time, due to natural selection, giraffes that have the longer neck are able to further survive. And so over time, we end up with giraffes having longer neck because they're more fit to survive in that environment. And so, as I've been mentioning, adaptations can take many generations, right? So this is not something that just happens in one lifespan. It's the idea that the populations within the population, the species or organisms that are more suited for their environment are able to better adapt and have more offspring. And so over time, we see that the newer generations will have traits that are more adapted to their environment. And so we brought about this idea of convergent evolution. We mentioned that in the previous talk, which is the idea that the natural selection causes adaptive traits, right? So traits that are more adapted, better suited, results in this evolution. And the conversion has to do with, even though you might have species that are in very different environments, so as we mentioned in the previous talk about the idea of the Patagonia versus the rabbit. You have one that's in South America, and you have another one that's in England, very far from one another, but yet they end up evolving to have very similar traits because in their individual environments, they live in pretty similar environments. So because they live in pretty similar environments, they end up having very similar phenotypic structures as well as similar behaviors. So again, natural selection results in adaptation to environment, and this adaptation can take many generations to evolve. So let's take a look at our little friend over here on the left-hand side, this vampire bat, and just take a look at some of the phenotypic characteristics that this bat has acquired in order to better adapt in their environment, right? So these bats have many adaptations that allows them to hunt and feed on blood. And so some of these adaptations include sharp teeth, heat sensor, and also this ability to have anticoagulant. So the anticoagulant prevents the liquid blood from coagulating or clotting to form a solid gel, right? Which is, just think about when you get a scratch and how, you don't want the blood to just bleed out. So it coagulates, it kind of forms a blood clot to prevent that. Or these bats have this anticoagulant in their saliva because they don't want the blood to that they're consuming to coagulate. So these bats have all of these physical characteristics that we can observe that help them find prey, right? So, for example, their large ears that we observe over here. Whoops, that was not a very good circle. But the large ears, this has a lot to do with their hearing ability, right? So these bats can use really high frequency sounds to be able to find their food, while additionally preventing them from hitting obstacles while they're flying around trying to find the food. But they also have this advanced hearing ability where they can actually also sense really low frequency sound. So they can sense both high frequency sound and low frequency sound. Additionally, this figure is pointing out that they have these incisor teeth right here. So these bats, because they prey on the blood of their prey, they have these two adaptations. One of them is actually their nose. They can actually sense heat in their nose, and so this allows them to be able to find blood vessels within their prey. And then once they actually find a blood vessel in the prey, their sharp incisor teeth allows them to actually, and they're really sharp, to make tiny cut in their prey skin. And so you can see how these different traits that these bats have allowed them to just kind of be able to evolve and be able to better find food. So to conclude, these bats have evolved over time, and through natural selection, they're more adapted to their environment. So let's kind of take a step back and kind of look at how we understand evolution now. So after Darwin came back from on the HMS in the 1800s back to England, he consulted with Alfred Russel Wallace, who had his own theory of evolution, which is this idea of survival of the fittest. So he believed that, yeah, the certain organisms within a population that are more fit can better reproduce, and so you have the survival of the fittest, right? Because they're able to pass their gene on. And so he sent his essay over to Darwin to kind of take a look at, and together they kind of found Darwin took what Wallace had theorized and kind of adapted even further and saying, okay, well, not only do you have these adaptation to the survival of the fitness, but you also have that as these fit organisms are able to have offspring, that over time you end up with these new species that evolve through natural selection. So that you have originally maybe you had a common descent. So you can imagine if you go back to the finches that they originally had the common descent of the mainland finch, but because they ended up residing on all these different islands, that not only did the finches with the best physical characteristic that allowed them to adapt and the behavior allowed them to adapt to the environment, but over time this isolated adaptation resulted in new species that came out, but all of these new species still had a common descendant. So I bring this about because you can imagine that when we were looking at in the first section, when we were looking at the Patagonian versus a rabbit, right? It's like, how did you have these two organisms that are nowhere, that live, these two different species that live nowhere near each other, evolve to have such similar characteristics? And so you can kind of imagine that perhaps maybe they originally had a common ancestor. So one thing that we haven't really talked about is how now we have all these different continents of land, but originally the earth was just like kind of more of one massive piece of land. But due to tectonic plates, over time, this massive piece of land started breaking off and separating. And so that's how you end up with all of these different continents, right? So you have these continents right here and here and here. So originally, you can imagine that these lands were a lot closer to one another, or even one massive land, but because of, like we mentioned, the tectonic plates, they separate. So perhaps these organisms had a common ancestor, and so when they got separated, they evolved to adapt to their particular environment. But we can see trace of similarity if we trace back to their common ancestor. So the rabbits, that we find in England, they have no means of reaching South America, but at one point, South America, Antarctica, and Australia were connected. So just take that into consideration. But hopefully, you can appreciate that through this theory of evolution, we now have the theory of how organisms that originally had a common descent are able to adapt and evolve over time and form new species through natural selection. Through the natural selection curve when certain organisms are more fitted and better to survive, and therefore better to be able to pass on to offspring these traits that are more adapted to their environment. Okay, so let's kind of look at some other example of biogeographical evidence here. So the idea that these different species based on their environment and geography can kind of adapt, but they might have had a common ancestor. So here we're looking at two different ones, the evolution of whales and evolution of the theropod. I hope you can appreciate by looking at this is just how certain features and anatomical physical characteristics might be passed on, but they over time might be more adapted to their environment. So if we start down here with this hypothetical skeleton right here, you can see that it has these legs, right? And as this might be the common ancestor of these other organisms we move through. But you can kind of see that as we move from land into water here, that maybe these limbs kind of start changing and adapting to their environment, right? Okay, so we start off right here, and over time, as these organisms are adapting from having to walk on land to swim, that you actually have these structures kind of being reduced to a different structure that's more well suited for its environment. So that now we have these modern whales that have these hind limbs that perhaps originally evolved from this common ancestors right here. But over time, because of their adaptation to live in water, these hind limbs have become what we observe here in these whales. Here, similar things where you have the evolution of theropod, where we're looking at how this fin over time might get reduced because it's not as needed as we move up over time, right? So you can kind of see that perhaps originally we needed scales when we were living in the water, but as we move to land, they are not really needed. So there's no reason for like it doesn't help. It's not that they lose the trait so much as that these features that aren't required don't give any survival benefit for survival fitness. So sometimes we end up with structures that are still present, but we no longer need them, so they kind of get reduced. And we'll see this when we look at vestigial structure a little bit. Whereas other features that is needed is kept, and so this you can see this with regards to where like that perhaps the eyes move, right? So as we move to different environment, organisms that have better features are better able to survive. And so let's look at this example of some structures that might be more adapted for these different organisms to be better adapted to their environment. So, for example, with vertebrates, we all have these structures that came from the common ancestors, right? But these structures have different functions that they serve depending on the organism itself. But you can kind of see that all of going from horse to human to whale and cats, that we all have from our common ancestor these vertebrate forelimbs, right? So these bones are organized, and their structure, so they're very similar, but they have different function depending on which organisms that you look at. So despite the fact that they have different functions, they have very similar structures to them. So this is known as homologous structure, when the structures are similar despite the fact that they have different functions. So we'll write different functions, right? So the function of the whale fin is very different than the function of a human arm, which is different than the function of a horse back leg or forelegs. But they have very similar, very similar bone structure. Okay, so this is homologous structure. How is this different than analogous structure? So with analogous structure, these two structures have very similar function, but their actual bone structures are not constructed the same way. So they differ in their actual structure. Okay, so you can kind of see, the structure here is very different, right? The bone structures, but they have similar functions. Whereas here you can see that these structures with regards to how we have these fingers, for example, are very similar, but we have very different functions. So that's homologous versus analogous. Remember how I said that certain structures will also get reduced over time when they are no longer really being used. So they don't always have to completely disappear, but a lot of times these structures just reduce because they just don't really help the organism succeed in any way. So they don't really contribute. So they don't add to survival of the fitness. So not so much that they disappear, but it's just that because they don't help with the survival, over time, sometimes they get reduced because they're kind of unused. And so this would be, for example, our tailbone. Like we, as humans, no longer have a need for a tail. We don't communicate with it. It doesn't help us survive in any way. So we still have the structure, but the structure kind of gets reduced and it's non-functional, right? Another example that we can look at is why do men have nipples? Like females have nipples because we need them for the mammary gland in order to actually feed the young, but males end up with these reduced features of nipples that don't have any function, but they're still present because we have a common ancestor, still evolved similarly, but they no longer for males have a function. Okay, and so that kind of gives us an idea of some different ways in which different structures can kind of evolve over time to make a sort of different organisms a better suited for the environment. So I hope that you kind of appreciate a little bit more about evolution at the end of this chapter, and that you learned something new. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one.